اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إني أسألك وأتوجه إليك بنبيك نبي الرحمة محمد صلى الله عليه وآله. يا أبا القاسم يا رسول الله، يا إمام الرحمة يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا الحسن يا أمير المؤمنين، يا علي بن أبي طالب، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا فاطمة الزهراء يا بنت محمد، يا قرة عين الرسول، يا سيدتنا ومولاتنا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيهة عند الله، اشفعي لنا عند الله. يا أبا محمد يا حسن بن علي، أيها المجتبى يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا عبد الله يا حسين بن علي، أيها الشهيد يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا الحسن يا علي بن الحسين، يا زين العابدين يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا جعفر يا محمد بن علي، أيها الباقر يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، قدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا عبد الله يا جعفر بن محمد، أيها الصادق يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا موسى بن جعفر أيها الكاظم يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا علي يا ابن موسى أيها الرضا يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا جعفر يا محمد بن علي أيها التقي الجواد يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا علي يا ابن محمد أيها الهادي النقي يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا محمد يا حسن بن علي أيها الزكي العسكري يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا وصي الحسن والخلف الحجة أيها القائم المنتظر المهدي يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله. Ask for hajat from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يا سادتي وموالي إني توجهت بكم أئمتي وعدتي ليوم فقري وفاقتي، ليوم فقري وحاجتي إلى الله، وتوسلت بكم إلى الله، واستشفعت بكم إلى الله، فاشفعوا لي عند الله، واستنقذوني من ذنوبي عند الله، فإنكم وسيلتي إلى الله، وبحبكم وبقربكم أرجو نجاة من الله، فكونوا عند الله رجائي. يا سادتي يا أولياء الله صلى الله عليهم أجمعين، ولعن الله أعداء الله ظالميهم من الأولين والآخرين، آمين رب العالمين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. لأرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات فاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Let's also remember all of those people who ask for dua and those who are suffering, struggling, going through difficult times, especially during this pandemic. Let's recite this verse from Surah An-Naml together 5 times. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. أَمَّن يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ 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 ويجعلكم خلفاء الأرض أإله مع الله قليلا ما تذكرون. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، خاتم النبيين أبي القاسم محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. Amma ba'd, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Tonight, very briefly, I wanted to discuss an important topic which has to do and deal with the identity, as to how do we define identity. This discussion, I'm sure, has been done many times on numerous circles. It's a discussion, the discussion of identity is relevant to every human being. For example, who we are as individuals, communities, as far as our nations. It's a lifelong discussion that can guide our actions and as well as our life choices. An individual who knows who they are is then able to dictate their destiny. That person will be able to work with other like-minded people to do the same collectively for their community. And that's something which you look for when it comes to doing something in congregation. So what is our identity? Who are we as Muslims? What does it mean to be the follower of Ahlul Bayt? And what is the identity of the righteous community? For example, if we are embarking on the journey as collectively as community to come about as a righteous community, now what is our identity? And what is the identity of those righteous communities that lived before or live simultaneously in our time, for example? So the following discussion will bring us closer to understanding our identity in becoming the righteous community, inshallah. When we discuss identity, we're not using the modern classification of ethnicity, race, nationality. Instead, we're looking at a universal classification based on principles that form an identity independent of time and space. It doesn't have to be, allocated to a specific time frame. And that can apply from the beginning of the time till the end of the time. The identity, we refer to henceforth refers to our connection to the principles that provide for the righteous community destined to advance itself as a humanity as a whole. So all human beings have the potential to be part of the righteous community, but ourselves extends to the entirety of humanity. And I'll get into these specific roles when we divide it into four different parts. So our desire to protect and preserve ourselves. Now, how do you define this ourselves? Where does that this ourselves come from? It's a universal pursuit that extends to every fellow human being. Our interest, is to protect all of humanity. You won't deny that factor. But initially, you protect your close ones, those right immediate to yourself, and then you build your way. And similar is the case when it comes to spreading something. You begin by your own reform, and then you reform your street, your society, your community, your city, your state, your country, and so on and so forth. So this is how the inqilabat or the revolutions come about. So we consider this as a fundamental feature of the righteous community, inspired by the purpose of God's final prophet, who was, of course, mercy to all the nations. He was rahmatan lil alameen. So there are four spheres of identity. Tonight, I will only discuss these or highlight toward these four spheres. Of course, the time is very limited on our Tuesday night programs. So our pursuit to define our identity is sourced in the desire to better understand who we are as individuals and as a community. So two things we need to define. Wanting to know who we are in an intrinsic need of every human being. More particularly, if you look at it, defining who we are is the key of sustaining our growth, development, as well as our advancement. So there are different dimensions to this identity. Our discussion of identity is within a sociological context through multiple spheres, and we will get into these multiple spheres. Humanity at large is one sphere encompassing multiple spheres within it. So when you look at humanity at large, then of course within that humanity you find multiple spheres. So we'll start from the core and expand outward. That's how you begin. You begin from that core, and then you build upon it. So our core identity falls within the principles and belonging to loving, following, and adhering to the Prophet and his holy household as the followers of Ahlul Bayt. That should be the first and foremost. This is the core of our identity, that we believe in this Prophet and we believe in his household. And you'll see how we expand upon this, where we derive our values and principles and set the tone of our lifestyles. Isn't that correct? Who do we want to be adhering to and following when it comes to defining our lifestyle? Is our lifestyle, or I should say, should our lifestyle be following anyone except Prophet and his household? That is a question for us to think about, sleep over it. In religious and theological terms of our core identity, we are servants of God. However, what distinguishes us on a sociological level in terms of core identity is that distinctiveness as followers of the Prophet's household, Ahl Bayt Rasul. So that's number one. The second sphere of our identity, which encompasses our core identity as followers of Prophet's household, is our identity in Islam, that we are Muslims. We're not isolated, independent, or outside of the faith of Islam. In fact, we are part and parcel to it. Though we differ with other Muslims in theological and as well as jurisprudential issues, as well as different interpretations and readings of the faith, we belong to the religion just as much as any other Muslim. Right? So never underestimate that. This is an essential point to emphasize and to clarify. Some may think that if an individual prides himself on belonging to some more specific, that individual is foregoing what is more general. So when you define yourself to a smaller group, then you're foregoing that more general group. That is not the case. In fact, that is not at all true, and we'll explain how. As followers of the Prophet's household, we acknowledge that our immaculate leaders sacrificed and lived for the sake of Islam. Isn't that the case? You look at the example of Imam Hussein. Look up the example of other Masumin who gave their lives and presented their sacrifice. Our affinity and attachment to them is derived from wishing to follow that perfect example of adherence to the Prophet and his message, which is what? Which is Islam. So the third sphere of identity is belonging to the broader faith tradition of monotheism. So once you go back to the core and from where we began, and now you see how we are expanding. So the third sphere of identity is belonging to the broader faith tradition, which is Tawheed. We are monotheists, believing in the core tenet that there is no God but God, Allah. We share this identity with billions of other believers in the world. There's billions of people, even outside of the sphere of Islam, who are monotheistic. As Muslims belonging to this broader sphere of identity, we believe that Islam is a religion that came to complete the other faiths delivered to humanity. So Islam is seen as the culmination of the other faiths and beliefs, as an enhanced and a more complete version of the messages that came before it. I don't want to relate this to how we're constantly upgrading our softwares in our devices, but that's basically how it is. Would you go back to the software that came back in 98 or back in the 90s? Or would you use the software which just came out, for example? Thus, its roots are derived from other divine Abrahamic religions. Islam is a completion of Judaism and a completion of Christianity. We share the universal belief in the oneness of God, which was part and parcel of both of these Abrahamic faiths. And we share the ultimate servitude toward God, the One. That is the third sphere of monotheism, which unites us with many other religions, billions of people around the globe. The fourth and the final sphere is our identity in humanity at large. You see how it even gets broader. We belong to the human race. We value and cherish that belonging as not a mere connection of being born in the same form as our fellow men, but acknowledging and the connectivity that we all have with one another in the deepest ways, in brotherhood and in equality. There's so many examples of this connection that you can derive and you can elaborate over, but of course, for the brevity of time, I won't go into those explanations. That sometimes these bonds are actually closer than even some of the family ties, right? In this instructive letter that Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib والسلام, had written to the governor of Egypt, Imam said that people are of two types: either your brother in faith or your equal in humanity. Look at how broad and all encompassing this sentence is. What did Imam say? I'll repeat. He said, people are of two types: either your brother in faith or your equal in humanity. We do not believe that we are better than anyone else. Get that out of the system. Nor do we believe that we have a greater right than anyone else. Get that out of the system if that exists. Because some adherents of earlier divine faiths may feel that way, that they're the chosen ones, they're the selected ones, they are the ones For them, the world was created. It's their right to rule, for example. They're better and superior, and so on and so forth. That's not what Islam preaches to us, that we're better than anyone and that we have a greater right than anyone else. Our belief is simple when it comes to our social dynamic and engagement with those around us. We are brothers or equals. Imam said, you're either brothers in faith or equals in humanity. It could be a lot of discussion just over this one sentence of Imam Ali. Thus, I have a natural self mandate to look out for my brothers and respect them, regard them, and cooperate with my equals. And believe it or not, intuitively, we are already doing this. When you're at your workplace, when you are out somewhere where you're outside of your own inner circle, you're already doing that. The cooperation already exists. Looking at these spheres of identity, I'll come towards a close. Looking at these different spheres of identity, it can be seen that both internally and externally, that we are not, nor do we believe in being an isolated community. You see how connected we are from the aspect of humanity, from the aspect of monotheism, from the aspect of Islam, and the inner core from being the believers of Ahlul Bayt. Now I'm going to connect it back to Ahlul Bayt. We are connected to every human being on this planet, whether it be a fellow follower of Ahlul Bayt, a brother of faith in faith of Islam, or neighbor who shares belief in God, or another human being who merely shares similar desires, hopes, and aspirations. Our connection as human beings is seen in too many unique ways. Differentiation is a reflection of our diversity that can be respected and honored within the framework of what? The commonality instilled in our spheres of identity. Remember these four. I'll conclude with the Shia identity. To identify similarly, usually brings an associated label and a particular belonging to some set of values and perhaps a group of individuals that people label themselves or different people. In addition to that, each identity holds a certain value as seen within the broader sociological context. So this group is called this group is called that. You're not dividing yourself when you're labeled like this. Focusing on the core identity, sphere of the followers of Prophet's household. That's what we began with, right? We find a number of names and labels ascribed to them. Some of them include as Shia, follower, Mu'mineen or Mu'min, believer, Mawali, supporter, or even some called Rafidi, the rejecter. Abu Basir, one of the companions of our fifth Imam, narrates that Imam Bakr والسلام, is stressed pride with our name. The Imam told him, لِيُهْنِئُكُمُ الْإِسْمُ, be proud of your name. Abu Basir asked, what is our name? May my soul be your ransom. Imam responded, Ash-Shia, it is that you are Shia. Abu Basir exclaimed, the people make fun of us for using that name. Imam then recited the following Quranic verse. He says, وَإِنَّ مِن شِيعَتِهِ لَإِبْرَاهِيمَ. Indeed, Ibrahim was amongst the followers of Noah, Hazrat Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam. Inna min shi'atihi la Ibrahim. Ibrahim was among his Shia follower, among Noah's Shia. And the word Shia was used for Hazrat Ibrahim because he was a follower of Hazrat Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam. And then Imam recited another ayah. فَاسْتَغَاثَهُ الَّذِي مِنْ شِيعَتِهِ عَلَى الَّذِي مِنْ عَدُوِّهِ. The story of Hazrat Musa alayhi salatu wasalam with Fir'aun. The one who was from his followers sought his help against him who was from his enemies. After that, Imam Bakr alayhi salatu wasalam repeated, فَلْيُهْنِكُمُ الْإِسْمُ. Be proud of your name. So be proud of your identity of Shia, of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wasalam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the tawfiq and ability to reflect over these different spheres of our identity so that we can live and survive and coexist with one another. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. متوجه زيارة. السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا نبي الله، السلام عليك يا حبيب الله، السلام عليك يا خيرة الله، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله، السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله، السلام عليك وعلى جدك وأبيك وعلى أمك وأخيك ورحمة الله وبركاته، السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء، السلام عليك يا معين الضعفاء والفقراء، السلام عليك الشمس الشموس وأنيس النفوس أيها المدفون بعد توس علي بن موسى رضا ورحمة الله وبركاته، السلام عليك صاحب العصر والزمان، السلام عليك إمام الإنس والجان، السلام عليك شريك القرآن، عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله مخرجك وظهورك وجعلنا من أوانك وأنصارك ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد.